a sort of singular, top-down tyrant. Hitler, Stalin, Lenin. It's like, no. A totalitarian state is ruled by the lie.
Hello and welcome to Off Script. My name is Stephen Edgington. How do you win the culture war? What lessons can we learn from Soviet dissidents? I sat down with Dr. Jordan Peterson to discuss these questions and more. Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Has the right lost the culture war?
We'll see. We'll see. The right lacks vision. They play a rearguard game. They don't have a compelling story to tell young people. And because they're conscientious, conservatives are conscientious, it's easy to hoist them on the petard of guilt. And the psychopathic narcissists of the radical left are unbelievably good at that. And so the conservative types are set back on their heels in a big way, and they don't know how to articulate their own principles. Partly because, like, if you're a conservative, you don't really articulate your principles. You just go about your business, right? You think, well, we'll just do things the way they have been done if they're working, and we'll go attend to our business, and we won't think too much conceptually, and we'll, you know, act practically. And so if you go listen to the Republicans, for example, I went to the Republican Governors Association meeting, and it wasn't inspiring, but the governors would present their policies sort of at the level of practical intervention. They're very practical people, and that's fine, except it doesn't work well against the messianism of the left. So the conservatives are in a position where they just get dragged towards the left one step at a time, and they're also terrible strategists. So, for example, in the United States, the education system, the public education system, eats half of the state budgets. Half. In New York, it's $30,000 a year to educate the typical student. So you imagine that means they're spending near $1 million a year to educate the typical class of 30, to not educate the typical class of 30 people. It's just beyond comprehension. 99% of the donations that are made by the teachers union politically go to the Democrats, and the bloody Department of Education, the faculties of education, have a hammerlock on teacher certification, right? So they have the worst students who go into education for the worst motives, and then they have the worst professors and researchers teaching them. And the faculties of education have done nothing but damage for the last 60 years. And the Republicans are too daft to notice that they've turned the entire culture over to the faculties of education. So it's no bloody wonder the conservatives lose. Like, as strategists, they're 10th rate, and they're not visionaries. Now, they have traditional right on their side, and that's a big deal, but you know, that can be overthrown by assiduous effort on the part of the radicals, and especially the psychopathic radicals. They thrive in chaos, so they're more than willing to turn the whole apple cart upside down in the hopes that they'll be able to scrounge among the ruins and dance in the flames.
It's this issue of how to fight back against this authoritarianism that I'm curious to talk about for this next hour or so, maybe longer, we'll see. But one issue recently has been debanking. So in Canada, a couple of years ago, during the trucker protests, you saw truckers whose bank accounts were closed down. They were removing money.
Yeah, we pioneered that here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the Chinese probably pioneered it,
well,
and then
it could be.
The Canadians took it.
At least among democratic countries.
Well, exactly. And in the UK recently, Nigel Farage has had issues with certain banks refusing to offer him services. Other politicians on the right have had the same thing. And the Conservatives have said in the UK, you know, they're warning the people who are celebrating this could happen to you.
Those are the useful idiots. The useful idiots always think, this will never happen to me. You see this with the Democrats in the US. So I just interviewed Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., who in principle is a Democrat. So they took down the interview. And that just shocked me, because it's a presidential campaign. And the lefties squawked and moaned and bitched for like 3 years about Russian collusion, all of which turned out to be a complete bloody lie because they were interfering with the election. And now YouTube can censor a presidential candidate mid-election, and there isn't a peep from the left. And the reason for that is they think, well, Kennedy's not a real Democrat, without noticing for a second that the definition of real Democrat is going to get increasingly narrow as we move forward. And that's already happened, you know. And I tried for years talking to the Democrats probably 36 senators and congressmen alike, always asking them the same question. I asked Robert Kennedy this too. When does the left go too far? And to a man or woman, they were either unwilling or unable to answer that question. And so, well, so here we are with this increasing, the increasing normalization of censorship and canceling. And this, by the way, is also a technique that's used by dark tetrad types, right? It's the female equivalent of antisocial behavior, right? So men who are antisocial tend to use physical aggression, but females who are antisocial tend to use reputation destruction and denigration, gossip, and behind the scenes maneuvering. And that's unbelievable. Now, men can do that too, and will, and do, especially online. But that's enabled by the corporations, you know, the media corporations who are in control of social media communication. So, yeah, people think, well, as long as it's only happening to Kennedy, it's like, have it your way, dimwits.
Now, this culture war, so-called, has been going on for a long time now, a fairly long time. You've been at the center of it for years and years and years, and you've really experienced some terrible abuse and really, I don't know how you went through all of that and came out as you are today. When you look back to the Soviet Union, other authoritarian regimes, obviously there were certain dissidents within those regimes, and I want to talk about them and how they coped with some of the most terrible experiences. Now, obviously you're not in a gulag, you're not in Auschwitz, so there's this kind of different level, isn't there? But what do you do when you know that things aren't going to get better? So let's say you're a Soviet dissident and there's just no hope. Do you survive? Do you fight? What do you do in that situation?
Well, everything you do in life is a matter of faith. And why would I say that? You know, the atheist materialist types, the skeptics will say, well, faith just means that you believe in things that aren't there. It's like, that isn't what it means. That's a 13-year-old critique of religious belief, a smart 13-year-old's critique of religious belief. It means that you stake your fate on some set of propositions. Now, the thing is that you do stake your fate on some set of propositions because you have to act in spite of your ultimate ignorance. So in the final analysis, you have to move forward in ignorance. And you move forward in ignorance by assuming the utility of either a stable set of principles and there can be alternatives, or by wavering. Well, here's one principle. Say what you need to save your skin in the moment or to gain advantage. And that means that you have faith in the power of deception. It means that you have faith in the power of the lie. Right? Right. Well, we know who the eternal ruler of the kingdom of the lie is. Or you can have faith in the truth. And that means to have faith in the truth means that you act in accordance with the assumption that whatever happens, if you tell the truth, is by definition the best thing that could possibly happen. And that means independent of the short-term consequences for you. Now, you're stuck with that anyways, because if you decide to lie, you're making the assumption that escaping scot-free or obtaining an undeserved advantage will pay off over the long run, all things considered. And you have no evidence for that at all, and everyone knows this. You can do something stupid to get out of a jam and get away with it, but the chickens come home to roost, and virtually everyone knows that. So you're going to evince faith in one strategy or another, or you're going to lie sometimes and tell the truth other times. And I wouldn't recommend that at all, because all that does is make you one confused person. So you're playing both ends against the middle. When Christ comes back, in the book of Revelation, he says the worst form of hell is reserved for the people who play both ends against the middle, who sit on the fence, right? So that's worth knowing. And so if you are wise and you have any sense and a certain degree of courage, then you say what you have to say, and you let the devil take the hindmost. And so that's what you do if you're a dissident. You make your bloody decision. And I've seen this. I just talked to Douglas Murray about this week, because Murray is notable for his courage, and courageous people are actually quite rare, much rarer than I even thought. Even though I knew they were rare, I didn't know they were as rare as they are. But Murray says what he thinks, and to hell with the consequences, so to speak. But he was also convinced that there is no better path forward than saying what he thinks. And we took that apart to some degree. I mean, first of all, if you say what you think, what happens to you is your happening. If you engage in a lie, that's not you. God only knows what it is and what you're serving. So if you lie to get your way, it's not your way that you get. It's the way of the lie. And if you think that's a good idea, go try it. And then you think, well, what's your evidence that's a good idea? Have you ever lied to yourself and have that work? How about you lie to your intimate partner? You think that's going to work out? Or your family members? Or you lie to your business partners or your customers? That's going to work, is it? Who thinks that? No one thinks that. People will still do it and they'll pretend that it's okay, but no one with an iota of sense ever thinks that. No one says to their child, well, you know, son, the best way forward in every situation is to just figure out what the other person wants to hear from you and tell them. And if you can lie to get yourself out of a jam, well, what the hell? You might as well do it, because that's what sensible people do. Nobody says that. You know, people might act it out, but no one believes it. And it is a matter of belief. So if you're a dissident, you say what you think, and you think, and I think, you know, I could either have a false reality on my side, or I could have the closest approximation to the truth that I can manage. Yeah, I'll pick the latter. Thank you very much. And if that means I have to stand up against my idiot governments, like, I'm way more afraid of the lie than I am of Trudeau.
But just looking throughout history at some of those dissidents in the Soviet Union, for example, and one of those people that you very much promote and have made far more well-known, I think, among many younger people is Solzhenitsyn and you know, his famous book, The Gulag Archipelago, and everything else. Why do you think so few people in the West know about these dissidents in the Soviet Union?
Well, because our education system in the West has been gripped by the delusion since the Second World War that authoritarianism was purely a right-wing phenomenon, which is, of course, to call that delusional. You know, there was Stalin, there was Lenin, there was Mao, there was Pol Pot. I mean, how many goddamn examples do you need? So obviously there's left-wing authoritarianism, but the game on the left is that, well, that doesn't really exist, or that was a misapplication of a perfectly functional theory. I asked a friend of mine, a Jewish guy, why so many Jewish people in the Soviet Union were attracted to communism. And he said, because it offered the possibility of universal brotherhood. You know, and that's the difference between, say, fascism in its more explicit forms and communism, is that communism at least says we could all be brothers, right? And that's an attractive doctrine. And I suppose at the time of the Russian Revolution, it wasn't self-evident that that idea was doomed to failure. Now, it's bloody well self-evident now, if evidence means anything at all to you. But there's that attraction in the communist doctrine of equality, which is sort of what we want in our families, and then universal brotherhood, which is a paradisal dream, I suppose. Of course, in the bowels of the communist conceptual structure are policies that are absolutely 100% murderously counterproductive, but they sound good too, like from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. You know, it sounds paradisal. It means, well, everybody could have their needs met. Of course, you instantly entangle yourself in, well, what is a need and whose need is deemed paramount? And that's complete bloody hell. And then, well, who defines ability? And how do you know when someone's contributing to the limits of their ability, right? Because they can still stand up. So, you know, there are these glossy, attractive slogans. Slogan, by the way, that's derived from two Welsh words, slwag and germ, and that means battle cry of the dead. Right, so these slogans that appeal to people who know nothing, who are thoughtless, who are motivated to some degree by their compassion, in the case, let's say, of the useful idiots, and then motivated by the desire to use compassion as a camouflage by the more psychopathic types. But it sounds good, and the left can claim, well, it was a really good idea, and look at all the terrible things capitalism does, and capitalism does concentrate power and wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people, which it does, but so does every other economic system ever invented or discovered. So it's not, attributable to capitalism. And so that, combined with this promise of universal brotherhood and the desire of the radical leftists to overthrow the capitalist endeavor, means that the faculties of education produce teachers who know nothing about what actually happened in the 20th century, because they don't know anything about anything at all. And even if they did know, would be inclined to downplay it or to excuse it with, hand waving, like, well, that wasn't real communism.
So let's focus. We've got the dissidents on one hand, who are very, very rare in the system. But what about the majority of the population? And let's focus on them for a moment, particularly in the Soviet Union. Maybe you can talk about other authoritarian regimes in the 20th century as well. But how did the majority of the population react to, say, Soviet propaganda, Maoist propaganda, Nazi propaganda?
Well,
and what was the aim of that propaganda?
They formulated it and propagated it and lived by it and distributed it. Like, it's a misapprehension. We like to think that totalitarian systems are ruled by a sort of singular top-down tyrant. Hitler, Stalin, Lenin. It's like, no. A totalitarian state is ruled by the lie. And the lie is the principle of governance, and everyone who lies is complicit in maintenance of the state. And so, the Soviet joke, we pretend to work, they pretend to pay us. And so a totalitarian state isn't the freedom-loving masses pining for deliverance out of the desert, but oppressed by the thumb of Stalin. It's every single person lying about absolutely everything to themselves and everyone they love 100% of the time. And sometimes that lie is just silence. So I've been looking at the book of Jonah. I'm going to open my new book with this chapter. So Jonah, as far as we know, is just minding his own business. And then he hears a voice. It's the voice of conscience, because that's established by this time in the biblical corpus. It's the voice of conscience. And it says, that city Nineveh, that's actually a city of foreigners, by the way, and enemies of the Israelites. So not a city that Jonah would necessarily be sympathetic towards, or vice versa. God says, that city Nineveh, and Jonah says, yeah. Well, they've fallen off the rails in a serious way, and I'm thinking about taking them out. And so I want you to go there and tell them of my intentions and of their transgressions. And Jonah thinks, I don't give a damn about the inhabitants of Nineveh. They're the enemies of Israel anyways. And that's a city of like 120,000 people. And why the hell would they listen to me? And if I go to Nineveh, well, that's going to be a very difficult voyage, and the probability of a dismal end for me is very, very high. And so how about no? So he jumps on a boat and goes in the opposite direction. And as anybody sensible would, and as most people always do. And so that's fine, except now the storms come. And the waves start to rise and the wind starts to blow. And the ship is in danger of capsizing. And so that's what happens when you hold your tongue, when you've been told to say something. And so the sailors, who are a rather superstitious lot, think there must be someone on this boat who isn't in the good graces of the gods they serve. And so they start to go through the passenger list and ask everybody. And Jonah admits that he had a direct commandment which he broke, and that he's the guy to blame. And so the sailors have to throw him overboard. And they don't actually do this out of cruelty. They do this out of necessity. And so, so now Jonah has run away from his conscience, and he's put the ship in danger, and now he's drowning. And you think, well, that's pretty bad, because he's going to die. But that's not bad enough, because the next thing that happens is a creature from the abyss itself comes up from the bottom of reality and takes him in its jaws and takes him all the way down to hell. And it is hell. He's 3 days down there, just like Christ harrowing hell, right? And there are explicit references to the bottom of the ocean being hell in the book of Jonah. So this isn't my imagination. And so what does that mean? It means if you hold your tongue when you have something to say, not only do you put everyone else in danger on the ship, and not only do you end up like in a place where you might die, but then something will happen to you so terrible that you'll wish that death would have taken you. And so now Jonah's at the bottom of the ocean, baking away because he didn't say what he was called upon to say. And he repents and says, all right, I've learned my lesson. Now that I've been in hell itself, I'll go to Nineveh as you commanded. And so the whale goes up to the shore and spits him out, and away he goes. And then he goes to Nineveh and he tells them what he has to tell them, and they actually repent, oddly enough, and don't destroy him. Maybe because he has the courage of his conviction by this point, and God spares the city from destruction. Well, that's what that story means. So you hold your tongue when you have something to say at your peril. And that's a sin of omission, right? And people are willing to pass that off. Why do I have to put my neck out? It's like, hey, man, part of the reason is you're putting your neck out no matter what you do. People don't understand that, eh?
But the most extraordinary thing is that there are some people who do tell the truth during these terrible regimes.
Well, when Lot and Abraham go to visit Sodom, Abraham bargains with God because God's going to take Sodom out. And Abraham says, because God says, the whole city's corrupt. And Abraham says, well, what do you mean, the whole city? You mean everybody? And God says, yeah, pretty much. And Abraham says, well, if there's 40 men there that aren't corrupt, will you spare the city? God says, yeah, okay. And then Abraham says, well, how about 30? And God says, you're pushing your luck, but yes. And then he says 20. And finally, he bargains God down to 10. Right. And what that means is that, I think what it means is that if 10 people can still tell the truth, there's hope. Once you get below that, if it's none, well, then you're in hell, right? And then the fire and brimstone will definitely rain down on your city. That's comedians, right? The comedians, they can tell the truth. And if there doesn't have to be very many people who can still put their head up above the parapet and say, here's something funny and true, very few people. So
let's talk about some of those cases and I think they're really interesting. Solzhenitsyn is someone I'm sure you know a lot about. Maybe you can talk about what inspired him and what happened to him, but also
he took responsibility for his condition. When he was in the Gulag, Solzhenitsyn had every reason to be a victim, because the reason he was in the Gulag was because of Hitler and Stalin. And so if you need someone to blame, man, those are two credible perpetrators. But Solzhenitsyn asked himself, he saw two things. He saw in the prison camps that there were religious believers who conducted themselves nobly under impossible conditions. And that really made him think. And then he realized too that the prisoners were running the camps, right? So people were enslaved by their own slavishness. And then he started to think, well, maybe the way I lived my life had something to do with why I ended up here. And by doing that, he did what Dostoevsky recommended people do. Dostoevsky said, every man is responsible not only for everything that happens to him, but for everything that happens to everyone else. Now, that's a crazy thing to say, but not exactly. And the reason for that is, if you followed the gospel injunction, let's say, if you were perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect, how much better would the world be? And the answer is, you don't know. Like, if you were the most glittering, shining example that you could possibly be, how much good could you do? And the answer, again, well, that's what your life's for, is to find that out. And so the fact that things are shaking and rocking, how much your sin is associated with the fact that everything shakes and rocks is a completely open question. And I think the world is actually constituted so that everything that happens is every individual's fault. And that goes along with the idea that each person has a spark of the divine within them that shouldn't be hidden, that you hide to your peril and to the peril of the world. Now, it's a strange metaphysical idea, but that doesn't really bother me, because life is no shortage of strange. So,
even more perhaps extraordinary than the story of Solzhenitsyn, and maybe you disagree with this, is the case of Hans and Sophie Scholl, the siblings in Nazi Germany. They were only teenagers at the time, who were part of the White Rose movement, and they printed these leaflets that were very much criticizing the Nazi regime at a time when very, very, very few Germans were willing to do that. Very few German adults were willing to do that, but they were willing to do that. They were Christian. They had deeply held moral beliefs, and the way that they died, people speculate, we don't know why they did it in the end, but they handed out these leaflets in a school, and they did it in a very obvious way. And the janitor at the school dobbed them in and sent them to the SS, and they were killed very, very quickly for a kangaroo court and everything else. Can you talk about their case? What makes them special? How did they, as children, react in a way that we would find so inspirational when so many of their adults around them failed in that sense?
Well, tracing out the causal pathway to courage is not a simple thing, right? I mean, I've seen people who've led lives of bitter misery by any standard, who did everything they could to be good people despite that. And had they become psychopathic criminals, the sociologists would have said, well, of course, look at the conditions of their existence. But I've met people who've been brutalized beyond comprehension, who decided nonetheless that they would aim up, tell the truth. Now, why are people capable of that? That's an eternal mystery. The Judeo-Christian doctrine is that we have free will. And I think that's true. Now, that doesn't mean I understand it. And I know that the relationship between free will and determinism is complex, and that certain aspects of our action are explicable in a deterministic manner, but not in the final analysis. Partly the reason for that is that a deterministic organism can't compute the transforming horizon of the future. So, because the future is actually unpredictable. So a deterministic mechanism can't adapt to it. But in any case, people make their choices, and God only knows how early you start doing that. It's very early. Carl Jung, when he was talking about the Oedipal complex, so for Freud, the Oedipal complex in some ways was top down, right? So a mother would be a smothering mother, would offer too much dependence and overwhelm her child. But for Jung, it was more like a dance of agreement. And so imagine a 6-year-old in bed, and maybe he has, I don't know, maybe he's a bit dehydrated, so he's got a headache. But really, he's upset because he didn't do his homework. And his mom comes downstairs, and maybe she's a bit lonesome because she's had a scrap with her husband for the 50th time that week. And she thinks, you know what, I wouldn't mind having the company. And the kid thinks, I wouldn't mind not going to school today. And the kid says, Mom, my head sort of hurts. And the mom says, well, dear, maybe you don't need to go to school today. And the kid thinks, well, really, I don't want to go to school because I didn't do my homework. And the mom thinks, really, I want the kid home because I'm lonesome. And they both think, yeah, we just won't say that part out loud. Right. And so is the kid making a moral choice? Yeah, we start making moral choices. God only knows how early. Unbelievably early. Terrifyingly early, I would say. And, why do some people end up courageous when so many don't? It's easier not to be. It's easier to cut corners and not bear your responsibility, not take the opportunities that manifest themselves to you, not pay for your sins in the moment. It's easier. And so there's 1,000 or 1,000,000 ways that you can be dishonest. But some people, they're paragons of virtue. And we've argued about that forever. The Calvinists thought that was predestination, right? It's the grace of God. I don't know how to explain it. It looks like choice to me. In the famous picture of God reaching down to Adam on the Vatican, on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you see God reaching down, and you see Adam reaching up, although not with a lot of effort, really, sort of languorously. But the existence is constituted in that manner, is that things offer themselves to us, but we have the choice about whether to receive them. And some people decide to stretch their hands out with a bit more effort and humility, and some people decide to take the easier path.
Do you think it's in the human psyche to resist tyranny? And does the number of dissidents vary across different cultures? So say in Nazi Germany, were there fewer or more dissidents than in the Soviet Union? Did it vary in Maoist China?
I don't think we know, although I would say that in free societies are only free to the degree that everyone is a dissident, right? Because the freedom is maintained by people's trivial decisions to engage in truthful interactions, in trade and in the relationships with each other. And so free people are truth-speaking dissidents. There's no difference between that and being free. So it's when that starts to become silence that things start to tilt in the tyrannical or the chaotic direction. Now, it seems to me that the bedrock provided by the Judeo-Christian narrative corpus is a necessary precondition for that, not least because that corpus has as its central proposition that the spirit of the truth is the highest principle, right? It's a proposition. And not only is that the highest principle, but that's core to our nature in the ultimate sense, and part of our divine obligation. And I don't see how you can dispense with that notion without dispensing with the whole damn ballgame. Now, of course, that's what Nietzsche thought too, right? I mean, he believed that the consequences of the death of God would be nihilism and totalitarianism, or that we would discover our own values. But that the psychoanalysts pretty much killed off that theory.
Are there any lessons that we can learn from those dissidents in the 20th century?
Well, Solzhenitsyn, you know, it was something he cited, I believe. One man who doesn't lie can bring down a tyranny. It's like, well, that's how everyone always brings down a tyranny. That's how you bring down the tyranny you use against yourself. That's how you bring down the tyranny you use against your wife. You tell the truth. So do you want to learn that lesson? Well, Solzhenitsyn put the boots to the Soviet Union. I mean, he wasn't alone, but he was a major contributor, let's say. You know, Reagan was a contributor. Pope was a contributor. Those would be the main three, I would say. And that was in large part because they didn't lie. And falsehood cannot withstand the truth. Well, that's an axiom of faith. And it's an existential, it's a strange thing, because this is, again, why the notion that you can orient your life by mere attention to the facts is erroneous. It's like, well, is it the fact of the matter that if you lived your life by truth, that would be optimal? And the answer is, you have to run the simulation to find out. It's not computable a priori. There's no way of deriving the moral before the story is told. And that's what you do in your life. That's the existential conundrum in some ways. That's what you're thrown into existence to determine. You know, how do you best make your way forward? Well, you pay your money and you take your chances. And this is something I'm trying to stress in this new book I'm writing, is you will have faith in something. Now, it might be a multitude of contradictory things, which just makes you a polytheistic pagan, but there's no non-faith route. So, and then the question emerges, well, you know, what would a wise person best have faith in? And I think it's the truth, partly because how are you going to orient yourself to the world with a false map? Like, how's that going to work? It's not going to work. And you might think, well, I can falsify it now and then, take a shortcut. It's like, not without falsifying your relationship with yourself, not without polluting the water from which, the well from which you draw water. It isn't how it works.
Do you think that your work as someone who is very high profile, talking about these issues and being part of that so-called resistance to this woke tyranny, to not find, sorry for not using a better word than that, but has that been successful in inspiring others? I mean, and I'm interested in what you think about the success of these other resistance movements that there have been around the world. In Canada, there was the trucker protests. In the Netherlands, there was the farmers. In the UK, we've had lots of radical feminists who are arguing against some of the gender stuff. So do you think that your role has been in any way effective in that, within those movements? And do you think that those movements themselves have been effective?
Well, I know that it's been effective to some degree within those movements because I've been in touch with the people who've organized those movements, and they've told me that. So, and I spoke remotely at the truckers' protest and was in contact with the truckers while they were protesting, partly on the strategic front. And the same was true in the Netherlands to a somewhat lesser degree. So, and then on the broader public front, well, I know that this is successful. I mean, that's why my wife and I keep traveling, because, if you looked at my life online, you'd think that I was being harried to death nonstop by, radical narcissistic psychopaths, but that actually only occurs online. Wherever I go in the world, it's not like that at all. I have one bad encounter in about 5,000 encounters, and all the rest of them are hyper positive. People are extremely polite to me. They always behave the same way. I guess there's three categories. There's the person who's been hurt at some point and who has recovered to some degree or is in the process of recovering, and that would be the bulk of the people that stop me. There would be the people who have been interested in what I say but feel compelled to tell me that they don't agree with everything I say, which that's sort of a response that always sort of flabbergasts me, because it's like, well, what makes you think I would expect that? And also, why are you telling me that? And I think it's because they want to play both sides against the middle. But that's a very small minority of people. I don't think more than about 1 in 100 do that. And then, now and then I run into somebody who's usually has never listened to a thing I've said, but who thinks they know what I'm up to. Or maybe now and then someone who actually does and is not happy about it. But all the interactions I have with people are positive. And I know that it's had an effect because I've sold 10 million books. And so, everywhere we go in the world, Tammy and I, we sell out arenas of 3,000 to 10,000 people. And I'm always talking about the same thing, which is really the adoption of responsibility in the fundamental sense. And I know that it's helped. And we can tell by going to these shows that it's helped, because everyone says that it's helped, and that's the testimony of hundreds of thousands of people now. So,
because there's two levels, isn't there, in terms of helping people? There's in their individual lives, do they tell the truth? Do they lie? Yeah. And there's the political level of, can you change this policy, the vaccine mandates, etc., that I suppose the trucker protesters were less successful in.
Oh, they were pretty successful. The COVID tyranny collapsed pretty precipitously after the trucker convoy, and they caused the collapse of the conservative leadership. And, the conservatives in Canada at that point were pretty damn wishy-washy and playing both sides against the middle. And the new leader has a lot more of a spine, by all appearances. We'll see to what degree he's handled to death by the political consultant types. But
do you see a distinction between those two?
Oh, definitely.
Things, though. I mean, the personal and the political, or are they linked in some way?
Well, you can't be a real leader without having your act together on the personal front. And for me, the fundamental theater of action is the individual, which is why I'm a psychologist, not a political scientist or an economist or a sociologist or a politician for that matter. Like, I think that, I was concerned throughout my whole life with the existence of malevolence. And that's a spiritual problem, malevolence, evil. And it's addressed at the individual level. And so that's always been my primary focus of concern. Once I learned that that really was a psychological issue rather than a political issue, I think you have to get your psychological house in order before you can be even remotely effective politically in the fundamental sense. Otherwise, you're just a tool of ideology or your own ego. And so I'm much more interested in operating at the psychological level than at the political level, although I do engage in some political discussion. To render unto Caesar what is Caesar's also means, to some degree, to give Caesar his due, right? And we're political as well as psychological, and we have political responsibilities. And it's necessary to translate the individual ethical ethos into appropriate policy. But you can't do that unless you can tell the truth. And you can't be a good leader unless you're capable of listening. And you have the humility that would go along with that. So I've thought about a political career in Canada multiple times, but first of all, I don't speak French, and so that's a problem. I could learn, but I haven't. So that would be an impediment. And second, I think I'm probably more effective doing what I'm doing than I could be in any political role in Canada.
Isn't the ironic thing that throughout this interview, we've talked about dissidents, we've talked about resisting sort of woke tyranny, but the woke people see themselves as resistors. They see themselves as dissidents. Maybe you disagree with that, but during the 2016 Trump election, there was this term, the resistance. That's how they saw themselves. So do you think they genuinely believe themselves to be resisting against this conservative elite?
Well, I think some of them do and some of them don't. I mean, the real pathological types, they just use all of that as maneuvering.
Is it a coping mechanism? Or?
Well, no, I think that there's endless reasons for people to view themselves as victims. You know, I mean, we are in the land of corporate giants, right? In a major way, and they're multinational, and it isn't obvious at all that they often act not in our best interests. I mean, that's certainly the case for the pharmaceutical companies, obviously, which is why their alliance with the radical left is quite the bloody miracle. And it is the case, as I said before, that in the capitalist systems, power and wealth accrue in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Now, that's true of every economic system. It's part of a much broader problem than the problem of capitalism. But it's easy for people to feel that they're put at an unfair disadvantage by extant power structures. And to the degree that those power structures are in fact corrupt and based on power, they have a valid complaint. Now, the question is, what do you do with that complaint? I mean, you could regard yourself as especially and narcissistically victimized and therefore deserving sort of special redress, or you could try to do something about it and also to understand your own role in propagating that power dynamic, right?
Well, they hold themselves up against these vast evil concepts like white supremacy. So they say they're fighting white supremacy, they're fighting this homophobia, they're fighting this transphobia that is endemic and systemic across society, across the elite. Do you see a comparison between that and how the Soviet revolutionaries, Leninist types, believed themselves to be fighting against that elite? And
well, if they did believe that, I mean, they were power mongers in the final analysis. And I mean, people like Lenin and Stalin just said whatever they needed to say to get as firm a grip on power, absolute power, as they could possibly manage. But look, one of the canonical variants of the universal hero myth is David and Goliath, right? And the reason for that is that the hero always does two things. The hero confronts chaos and what is terrifying and generates order. That's the dragon fight fundamentally. But the hero also slays the oppressive giant and rekindles society, right? So takes out the evil king. You see that in the story of the Lion King, for example, right? And takes out the evil uncle, which is a very common variant. And the reason for that is that social hierarchies ossify and tilt towards power. And so that's also part of the critique of the left, right? But the left always goes too far. The radicals, they say, it's nothing but power. It's like, no, it's not nothing but power. The fact that power corrupts the social enterprise and the psyche, for that matter, does not mean that power is the fundamental motivating principle. And that's actually of extreme import. I actually think play is the fundamental motivating principle, not power. I think the antithesis of power is play, and free play in particular. And it's a much more effective means of adaptation and much more enjoyable than the naked expression of power. But people are inclined in their attempts to manifest an unsophisticated heroism, that's a good way of thinking about it, to, oppose the man, and then also to assume that the mere complaint, especially public, which is the equivalent of praying in public, by the way, just the mere public display of your rejection, your objection, constitutes sufficient moral effort. And of course, the idiot universities are absolutely complicit in putting that message forward. It's like everybody should be an activist. It's like, really, that's your solution for the world's woes, is to train potentially competent young people to parade their whiny moral virtue publicly. Well, There's nothing in that that's positive. Go out there and do something. Fix something. Fix something. Something real. And you know what? That's what I've been attempting to, that pathway is one I've been attempting to outline to my watchers and viewers, and lots of people are trying that, and it works. And then they're thrilled about it, because then they have something real. And that's way better. It's way better. So the propagandists always subvert the mythological to the ideological, always. And so there's always the ring of truth about their pronouncements, you know. I'm standing up against the man. Well, you should be. But, you know, the Judeo-Christian revolution, in many ways, if you think about it psychologically, was the notion that the tyrant you face most morally is the one that lurks in your heart, right? It's the removal of malevolence from the external world. It's the continual removal of it. So as the idea of God progresses, you see the idea of God moving from the God whose manifestations in nature produce awe to the God whose voice is revealed within, primarily in the voice of conscience. So it's a psychologization of the idea of the divine. Same thing happens on the malevolence front. It's like, well, what's evil? Well, a predator, a wolf, a snake, a raptor, right? A dragon. That's an amalgam of all those things. That's evil. What's evil? Your tribal enemy. What's evil? Your betraying brother. What's evil? Your self-betrayal. What's evil? The spirit of evil that lurks within you. Yeah, that's it. That's the most sophisticated representation. And you could also argue, and you know, it's a debatable point, but I think it's true, that the way you fight external tyranny most effectively is by having defeated the tyrant that lurks within and then acting in accordance with that. Because then your words and your actions speak of your having overcome the devil and his temptations in the desert. You know, when Christ is in the desert, trying to conceptualize the nature of his kingdom, Satan appears to him and says, you could have the world and everything in it. You could be a political master. You could be a king. You could be the emperor in the worldly sense. And Christ thinks, what does he think? That's not good enough. That's not right. Well, you can manipulate, maneuver on the power front, you know, and you can end up ruling over hell, as it turns out, if you do that, but you can end up ruling, or you can try to put your house in order, and then you inherit the kingdom instead of the world, you know, and people think that's a superstition, but that's because they don't understand what the story means. So there's this idea that you should lay up treasure in heaven where it doesn't rust. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's say you and I have an honest conversation. We've done that before, right? You interviewed me 3 years ago?
2 years ago.
Okay, and you didn't play any tricks. Okay, so what was the consequence of that?
Well, it did well.
Okay, what does that mean? That it did well.
People were interested.
Okay, and so it got a lot of viewers. And what was the consequence for you?
I suppose it made me feel proud of my work.
Okay, well, that's a good thing, right? To make you feel like you're doing something worthwhile. All right, and then when you asked me to do this interview, I said yes. All right, so why did that work? Well, it's because you comported yourself without treachery as a journalist. So you accrued something genuine on the reputational front. Okay, well, moths can't devour that, and rust can't destroy it, right? Time doesn't decay it. Quite the contrary. You store your genuine treasure in your genuine reputation, right? Right. This is why you have to treat other people properly, like they're you, because they are in the most fundamental sense. Well, so that's part of the kingdom of heaven. It's that it's immutable to earthly degradation. Well, what does that mean? Well, psychologically, it means that we figured out a long time ago that there's no better place to store future wealth than in your reputation, because then everybody wants to be around you and they want to interact with you. They offer you opportunities. And if you fall on hard times, they're there to help you because they trust you. It's like everyone I know that's truly successful. I'll give you an example. So I saw this in the professoriate continually. There were two types of professor, especially in relationship to the graduate students. There were the professors who had time for their graduate students and who were extraordinarily generous with their ideas and with publication credit. And so these were people, you'd go talk to them. My supervisor, Robert Peel, was one of these. He always had time, and he was never less than forthcoming with his creative ideas. And then if we published, he would assign credit where it was due and put himself appropriately in the background when that was requisite. So what did that mean? Well, first of all, it meant that he was a never-ending font of ideas because he'd give them away, and that indicated to himself that he had faith in the source of his ideas, and the reward that he received by giving away his ideas produced the flourishing of the system within him that produced ideas. See, because what happens is that if there's a part of you, your neural architecture, that can generate ideas. Well, if you reward that, it grows. So if you give away your ideas and you get positive feedback as a consequence, that well will deepen and broaden, right? And so how could that possibly be to your disadvantage? It's very different than a narrowly self-serving, this was my goddamn idea, I'm going to be first author on the paper, and don't you dare steal my idea. Well, those people, I just saw them over time. They'd get to the point where they literally wouldn't have an idea. And then they'd even be grasping more tightly to the ideas that they had. Well, that's not a wise strategy.
That's going back to the idea of the dissidents versus the sort of masses who were able to accept and willing to accept that lie that the regime perpetuated. And I'm fascinated, and I know that you are as well, with those people who chose the completely opposite path to what you just mentioned, i.e. the evil people, the tyrannical people, the people who headed these regimes, the Stalins, the Hitlers, the Maos. There is this idea in history of great men, the great men of history. Do you think that this theory is legitimate? Do people make these huge influences on the societies around them? Or do you believe in the alternative theory, which is that they are working merely within the bounds of the masses, within the bounds of the sort of flow of history, if you like?
Well, I would say that a great man, in some ways, gives voice to the present. So there's a dynamic relationship between that greatness and the social surround. But it's certainly true, as far as I'm concerned, that everything is moved forward as a consequence of individual effort on every front. That's why I think the individual is the right level of conceptualization and analysis. And so, are there great individuals? Well, obviously. And they're on the forefront of development, right? They have and one of the great advantages of our communicative ability is that we can all share in the benefits of that stellar edge adaptation in all directions simultaneously. So that's a great thing. And I think that people are called upon to act in accordance with that conceptualization. I think everyone has it within them, has something. I think everyone has something, for lack of a better term, divine about them, and that they have something to bring into the world that no one else can bring in, that without which the world is lesser and often profoundly lesser. So that, along with that divine value that we all have a divine responsibility. And the upside of that is that that's where meaning is to be found. Right? This is another thing that I've been successful at communicating to young men in particular. It's like, well, why be responsible? Because it's meaningful. Well, why do you need that? Well, you're going to suffer there, buddy. You better have something to rely on when the storms come, or they'll take you out, or you'll wish you were dead.
We're all fascinated in these individuals who have changed and moved history, I think. You can walk in any city around the world and you'll see statues of these great men, whether they're local people, national heroes, figures, or even more evil figures like Lenin and Stalin. Mm-hmm. And as someone who's interested in history, as someone who loves reading biographies, reading about people like Bismarck, who were utterly demonic in their actions, incredible humor. I don't know if you studied him, but you should if you haven't. I get the sense that the great men of history, that era may have ended. And you look at the leaders today and you just see mediocrity. So that's a good example. So maybe you disagree with me. Yeah.
No, they're still around. There's lots of them, you know. No, they're still around.
They may not be the political leaders, but they may be in other areas. So you say Musk and Rogan, those are two very specific people.
Yeah, I've met lots of great people, you know, who are shouldering their weight and doing it properly, and thank God for that. Yeah, politically, less so.
Why are we churning out these leaders like Macron, like Biden, like Trudeau? Where does this phenomenon come from? Because they seem so uniform across the West.
Probably because our methods of communication were unable to distinguish from chaff for a long, long time. I think that might be changing with long-form political dialogue, because it's a lot harder to hide if you have to talk for 2.5 hours. So, you know, the soundbite, the TV in particular lent itself to a kind of brainless, momentary glibness and attractiveness, right? And partly because TV, well, it had a very narrow bandwidth. It was extremely expensive per minute. Everything had to be reduced to a soundbite. And it really stressed a certain kind of physical attractiveness. And so none of that helped at all. But those, you know, that period of time is probably coming to an end. We'll see.
It's interesting because social media has really shone a light on our politicians in a way that we haven't experienced in the past. So people like Bismarck, people like Caesar, these were mysteries to the general public. People did not know what was going on in their private lives. They barely knew anything about them beyond what their propaganda was telling them, or beyond what the press at the time, or whatever the oral communication was telling them about these people. So do you think that is one area where there's been a huge difference between the past and now, and where we can see our leaders in a very different way? Do you think that sort of bubble has been burst?
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I suspect it might have been, because I do think, like I've seen over the last 2 years, in particular 3 years, particularly in Canada and the US, that many political types are turning away from the legacy media and its emphasis on appearance to the new media and its ability to deliver content. And I think it will differentially reward people who are the real thing. It's very hard to be fake for 2.5 hours on YouTube in a spontaneous conversation, you know. And I think the people who are inclined to be fake won't even do those interviews, because they'll just exhaust themselves. So I think that's a very positive development. Now, you know, the censorial tyrants might have a word or two to say about that. I mean, YouTube took down my interview with Robert Kennedy, which I'm very unimpressed by, given that they did that during an active presidential campaign. And I think that was a traitorous act. So, but nonetheless, you know, there's lots of other avenues for communication, and the censors haven't been able to shut down genuine dialogue. And in fact, quite the contrary. I mean, Rogan in particular, he's a fascinating phenomenon, because he did what he did pretty much by himself, right? He's got his producer. There's 2 of them. And all Rogan did was ask stupid questions, you know.
But for me, you're as interesting as Rogan, I suppose. I mean, I'm 23. I was a young man when I read your books. You know, you may have guessed, but I think you changed my life in a way, in terms of what the advice that you were giving. And as I said, I find individuals fascinating. So I want to ask a question about you for a moment. Since 2016, how do you think your life has changed? How do you think you have changed? How has your outlook towards the world changed?
Well, my life was flipped upside down in many ways, because I had to give up my professorship and my research enterprise, and I'd put a lot of time and effort into those, and I liked doing them, and I was good at it. And particularly the research enterprise collapsed entirely. Now, I've been able to duplicate the teaching enterprise on a much broader scale, and that's been extraordinarily useful and fulfilling. and much better. So there's no net loss there. But the research enterprise, that was a real loss. And then my clinical practice became impossible too. And that really still irritates the hell out of me, because I knew those people extremely well. And we were getting places. You know, we had a real relationship, sometimes one that had lasted a decade, and it just blew up. Plus, you know, the College of Psychologists has been on my case ever since 2016, and they're costing me $90,000 a month in legal bills, which I'm also not very impressed by. And every single allegation they've brought against me is not only unwarranted, but absurd and procedurally incompetent to a degree that's almost unimaginable. So that was annoying. There were a lot of harrowing experiences that went along with what's unfolded over the last 7 years, particularly in the first 4 or 5 years, because every week, month, something like that, there'd be some new scandal, generally fulminated by some journalist who was narcissistic, whose sole goal in interview was to trap me into saying something that would demolish my reputation to their renown. And every time that happened, things were unstable for weeks or months even, but it reversed. And now we've learned that it reverses. So it's much less worrisome now. And so that's one thing. That's one way I'm different, is that I know now that if you're careful and you get attacked and you hold fast, that the net outcome will be positive if you can tolerate the intermediary disruption. So that's a very useful thing to know. So now if, you know, someone scurrilous says something potentially reputation devastating, my family has learned just to watch and wait and watch it flip around. Because it is the case that the people who went after me most pathologically did me the most good. And that isn't something, I didn't know that. I didn't know that's how the world worked. That's part of the reason why you can welcome assault. You know, because you need to know what your attitude is, right? You need to know what your attitude is towards tragedy. And your attitude towards tragedy is that you should bear it with hope. Because, well, what else are you going to do? You're going to descend into the pit of victimhood? I mean, even if the world has been stacked up unfairly on top of you, well, construing yourself as a helpless victim and becoming bitter and resentful, and then murderous and then genocidal, that's not helpful. It just turns tragedy into hell. So you're called upon to maintain faith and hope in the face of the existential catastrophe of existence. And then with regards to malevolence, it's, well, you know, do you embrace your enemy? I suppose if you were a master, you could do that.
So there are advantages of suffering